I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, subtle at first, but as time passed, they became impossible to ignore. My wife, Jessica, had started acting distant over the past few months, always claiming to be too busy with work or some new hobby she had taken up, something about volunteering at a local shelter. I wanted to believe her. After 14 years of marriage, I thought we were rock solid. I thought we trusted each other. But something had shifted between us, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The late nights, the constant texting, and the sudden need for privacy when she was on her phone. It all added up. At first, I blamed myself. I told myself that maybe I was being paranoid or insecure. I even tried to be a better husband, more attentive and affectionate, but nothing seemed to change. If anything, it seemed to push her further away. It wasn't long before I decided I needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. I started by casually asking about her volunteering without being too obvious. I asked what the shelter was called, what kind of work she was doing, and the people she met. Her answers were vague, and that only fueled my doubts. One day, when she left her phone on the kitchen counter, I seized the opportunity to check her recent contacts. There was a number saved under the name Alex, with no last name. It wasn't a name I recognized, and I knew most of her friends and coworkers. When I asked who Alex was, she said he was a fellow volunteer who occasionally helped her with the shelter work. Her explanation seemed plausible, but something in her tone was off. It was too rehearsed, too convenient. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. So, I took matters into my own hands and did something I never thought I'd do. I installed hidden cameras around the house. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew if she found out, it would likely be the end of us regardless of what I discovered, but I needed to know what was happening behind my back. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. A week after setting up the cameras, I came home early from work one Friday. I had told Jessica that I was working late, wanting to see if she'd take the opportunity to sneak around. Sure enough, when I reviewed the footage later that night, I saw him, Alex. He was a tall guy with tattoos covering both arms, the kind of look that screamed trouble. They sat together on the couch, talking in hushed voices, and before long, things escalated. She didn't even hesitate as he wrapped his arms around her. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I felt my stomach churn, my hands tremble, and my chest tighten as I watched my wife of over a decade kiss another man in our own living room. The worst part was the familiarity in their movements, the ease with which they touched each other. This wasn't a first-time fling. It had been going on for a while. I should have stopped watching, but I couldn't. The longer I stared at the screen, the more I wanted to hurt them both for what they were doing. But then, something else caught my eye. After they finished and Jessica went upstairs to take a shower, I saw Alex casually wandering around the house, his eyes scanning the rooms as though he were casing the place. He stopped by the shelves where I kept some of my old valuables, my grandfather's watch, a couple of signed sports memorabilia pieces, and some vintage coins that I'd inherited from my dad. He glanced over his shoulder, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small bag. I watched in disbelief as he began stuffing some of my things into it, his movements calm and practiced, as if he'd done this 100 times before. I had set up the cameras to catch an affair, but I ended up uncovering a whole other level of betrayal. Jessica had brought a thief into our home, a man who not only stole her loyalty but was now literally stealing from me. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was personal, and I was going to make them both pay. I could hardly sleep that night. The anger and humiliation kept churning inside me, twisting my thoughts into dark shapes. It wasn't just that Jessica had betrayed me, but she had brought this thief, this criminal, into our home. Our sanctuary had been violated, and I was left to pick up the pieces while they carried on without a shred of remorse. As the hours passed, my need for revenge grew stronger. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to make sure they faced the consequences. The next morning, I did some digging. I looked up Alex's number from Jessica's phone, tracing it back to a guy named Alex Keenan. A quick online search turned up his criminal record, 2 stints in prison for theft and burglary. I felt a bitter mix of vindication and rage. Jessica wasn't just having an affair, she was sleeping with a known felon. What had she gotten herself into? What had she dragged me into? I knew then that I needed more than just footage of them together. If I was going to make them pay, I needed undeniable proof of his theft. So, I began setting the trap. Over the next week, I pretended like everything was normal. I didn't confront Jessica. I didn't let on that I knew what was happening. Instead, I upgraded the hidden cameras, making sure they captured high-definition footage of every corner of the house, especially where I kept my valuables. I also took inventory of everything I had, down to the last detail. That way, if something went missing, I could prove exactly what was stolen and when. Then, I waited. It didn't take long. The following Tuesday, Jessica claimed she had a late meeting at work. I knew better. I checked the cameras remotely from my phone and saw Alex walking through the front door about 30 minutes after she had left. I watched in real time as he started his routine, making himself at home in our living room while waiting for her. The anger burned in my chest as I saw him lounging on our couch, sipping a drink that he had poured from my liquor cabinet. After a while, he got up and started walking through the house, just like he had done before. This time, I was ready. I had left out a few items that looked valuable but weren't worth much in reality. Cheap replicas of antiques, some old sports memorabilia that didn't hold much actual value. They were bait, and he took it. I watched as he slipped several pieces into his bag, just as casual as ever. But then he made a mistake. He wandered into the bedroom, where I had hidden another camera. As he rifled through our drawers, his phone rang, and he answered. "Yeah, babe, I'm just finishing up. I'll be out of here before he gets back." "Don't worry," he said, a grin spreading across his face. It was like a knife twisting in my gut to hear him call her babe in our bedroom, but I kept my cool. This was the kind of evidence I needed. I recorded everything, making sure I had a backup of all the footage. When he finally left, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He didn't know it yet, but he had just sealed his own fate, and Jessica's too. The next step was to contact the authorities. I made an appointment with a lawyer to discuss my options. When I showed him the footage, he raised an eyebrow and looked at me with a mix of pity and admiration. "You've got enough evidence to press charges," he said. "We can nail him for theft. And if you want to take it a step further, we could go after your wife, too. There's enough here to suggest she's complicit." The thought of dragging Jessica through the mud was painful. Despite everything, part of me still loved her, or at least loved who she used to be. But the reality was staring me in the face. She wasn't the woman I married, and she sure as hell wasn't innocent in all this. She knew who Alex was and what he did. She had willingly brought him into our home, and I had no reason to believe this was the first time he'd helped himself to my belongings. So, I agreed to press charges against both of them. It felt like crossing a line, but I had no choice. They had crossed the line first. The hardest part was pretending like nothing was wrong while I waited for the authorities to make their move. Jessica carried on as if everything was fine, oblivious to the fact that her perfect little world was about to come crashing down. I kept my composure, even when she acted affectionate, even when she tried to make small talk about our future. It was all I could do not to snap, to tell her that I knew, that I'd seen it all, but I held back. I wanted her to be blindsided when the time came. And then, about a week later, it happened. It was a Friday morning when the police showed up at our door with a warrant. Jessica's face went pale when they asked to search the house. She tried to act confused, but I saw the panic in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how much I knew. As they searched the house, I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out what was happening. And then they found the bag of stolen items in the back of Alex's car, parked just around the corner from our house. The officers asked her some questions, and that was when it hit her. She wasn't just in trouble. She was in deep. They arrested Alex that afternoon, and Jessica was taken in for questioning. I watched from the doorway as they led her away, her face a mixture of shock and betrayal. She looked back at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of explanation, some kind of mercy. But I just stared back, unblinking. This was just the beginning. I thought I would feel a sense of relief once the police took them away. I thought seeing them finally facing justice would give me some kind of closure. But as I watched Jessica being led out in handcuffs, something twisted inside me. She was crying, her face flushed red, and she kept looking back at me as if I were the one betraying her. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her that this was her fault, that she was the one who had thrown away everything we had built together. But I kept my mouth shut. There was nothing left to say. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with the lawyer, and more sleepless nights. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I kept playing the footage over in my mind, replaying every detail of what I had seen. It wasn't just the infidelity that haunted me, but the cold realization that Jessica had lied to my face, day after day, without a shred of guilt. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had allowed a thief into our lives and into our home. She had put us both at risk. The charges against Alex were straightforward. He was caught red-handed with the stolen items, and with his criminal record, the evidence was more than enough to get a conviction. But when it came to Jessica, things were more complicated. The lawyer had explained to me that proving her complicity in the theft wouldn't be easy. The prosecution would have to establish that she knew about the crimes and willingly participated, rather than just being an unwitting accomplice. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a bombshell landed. During questioning, Alex claimed that Jessica had not only known about the thefts, but had actively helped him by telling him where I kept certain valuable items and when the house would be empty. The idea of my own wife conspiring against me made my blood run cold. The evidence backed up at least part of his story. There were texts on her phone from Alex that hinted at them planning their little heists. And though she hadn't replied directly to those texts, the timing of her messages about when I'd be home was suspicious. It was enough for the prosecution to add charges of complicity and conspiracy against her. When I heard the news, I didn't know whether to be furious or devastated. A part of me had wanted to believe that maybe she had just been in over her head, that she had made some terrible choices but wasn't completely rotten to the core. But now, with the charges piling up, it was clear that I had been living with a stranger for years. Jessica was released on bail, and that's when she came back to the house, our house, where everything had happened. I had thought about changing the locks, but legally, she still had a right to be there, at least until the divorce was finalized. When she walked through the door, I was in the kitchen, staring at a half-empty bottle of bourbon. I didn't even look up when she called my name. "Tom, please, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. She looked like a mess, hair disheveled, makeup smudged, her clothes wrinkled. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity for her, but it quickly evaporated. "Talk?" I replied, my voice cold and distant. "What exactly do you want to talk about, Jessica? About how you've been lying to me for months? About how you brought a criminal into our home and helped him steal from me? Or should we start with the fact that you're facing 2 years in prison?" Her eyes welled up with tears, but I could see that flicker of defiance behind them. "I didn't know he was going to steal, Tom. I swear. I was stupid, okay? I was just trying to—" "Trying to what, Jess?" I snapped, slamming the bottle down on the counter. "Trying to destroy our life? Because that's exactly what you've done. And don't pretend you didn't know what kind of man he was. He's a convicted thief. Did you really think he'd changed? That he'd suddenly become a good guy just because you were sleeping with him?" She recoiled at my words, her face crumpling as she started to sob. "I never wanted to hurt you, Tom. I cut her off. But you did. Over and over again. You hurt me. And now you're going to pay for it." I grabbed the stack of legal papers sitting on the counter and threw them at her feet. "That's the divorce paperwork. Sign it and get out." She knelt down to pick up the papers, her hands trembling. "Tom, please. I'm begging you. Let's just talk this out. We can fix this." "Fix this?" I scoffed. "You don't get it, do you? There's no fixing this. It's done. You chose him over me. You chose this path, and now you have to deal with the consequences." Jessica stood there, clutching the papers to her chest as if they were a lifeline. For a moment, it looked like she might try to argue, to plead her case one last time. But then, as if a switch flipped inside her, her expression hardened. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you want." Without another word, she turned and walked out the door. As I watched her go, part of me wanted to stop her, to say something, anything, to try to understand why she had done this. But the other part of me, the part that was still seething with betrayal, stayed silent. There was nothing left to say. Over the next few weeks, I kept my focus on the court proceedings. Alex's trial was quick and predictable, given the overwhelming evidence against him. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As for Jessica, the judge didn't go easy on her, either. The texts, combined with Alex's testimony, were enough to convince the court that she had been complicit in the thefts. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison. When the verdict was read, she didn't even look at me. She kept her head down, her face a mask of numb resignation. I thought I would feel a sense of triumph, a feeling of justice served, but all I felt was a deep, aching emptiness. I had one, but at what cost? Now, I was alone in the house that no longer felt like a home. The silence was deafening, and the memories of what had happened echoed in every room. I had gotten my revenge, but it brought me no satisfaction, only a hollow reminder of the life I had lost. I thought the house would feel peaceful once they were both gone. I thought it would feel like a fresh start, as though I could finally put the past behind me and rebuild. But it was just quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that hangs in the air, suffocating, making it impossible to escape the memories that seemed to cling to every room. It wasn't just the reminders of Jessica that haunted me, her favorite blanket still draped over the couch, the half-used bottle of her perfume left on the dresser. It was the constant replay of everything I'd learned over those last few months. The look on her face as she walked out in handcuffs, the way she had tried to convince me that she didn't know what was going on, as if ignorance would absolve her. I had watched our life unravel, and now all that was left was the unraveling itself. The neighbors had heard about the arrests, of course. News like that spreads quickly in a small community, and it wasn't long before people started avoiding me in the grocery store, giving me pitying looks when they thought I wasn't looking. I had become a kind of spectacle, the poor man who had been betrayed and robbed by his own wife. People whispered about me behind my back, and though they never said it to my face, I could feel the judgment in the way they looked at me. I was the fool who hadn't seen what was happening under his own roof. One afternoon, I received a call from a lawyer representing Jessica. He wanted to discuss the terms of our divorce and the division of assets. Even though she was behind bars, she still had legal rights to part of what we owned together. I felt a surge of anger. Why should she get anything after what she'd done? But the law was the law, and there wasn't much I could do about it. As we went through the formalities, her lawyer's voice droned on, listing out the items she wanted. Some of the furniture, her personal possessions, even half of the savings account. I listened in silence, my hands clenching and unclenching as I tried to keep my emotions in check. When he finally finished, I asked him one question. Does she regret it? I said, my voice cold. Does she even care what she's done? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Thompson, the lawyer said, I'm not in a position to speak on my client's emotions, but I will say that she expressed remorse for her actions. She said she never intended for things to go this far. Is that supposed to make me feel better? I replied bitterly. Is that supposed to change anything? Of course not, he said quietly. I just thought you might want to know. I hung up without another word. The fact that she felt remorse now, when it was too late, only made me angrier. It was like she wanted sympathy for the mess she'd made, as if admitting she'd made a mistake would somehow absolve her of all the pain and betrayal she had caused. But remorse didn't erase what had happened. It didn't bring back the life we'd lost or the years that had been shattered. Weeks passed, and I fell into a kind of routine, though calling it a routine might have been giving it too much credit. I got up every morning, went to work, came home, and spent the evenings either staring at the television or going over the divorce documents for the 100th time. It was like I was stuck in some kind of limbo, unable to move forward but with nothing left to hold on to from the past. One day, I received a package in the mail, a small box addressed to me with no return address. I opened it to find a letter inside, along with a small leather pouch. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper and recognized Jessica's handwriting. Tom, the letter began. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you do. There are things I need to say, even if they don't make a difference anymore. I know that I've ruined everything, and I know you probably hate me now. But I need you to understand that I never wanted any of this to happen. I was lost, Tom. I was feeling things I didn't know how to deal with, and when Alex came into my life, he made me feel alive again in a way that I hadn't felt in years. That doesn't excuse what I did. It doesn't make it right. But I need you to know that it wasn't about you. It was never about you. I scoffed under my breath. The words felt hollow, just more excuses. If it wasn't about me, then why had she dragged me into it? Why had she brought that thief into our home? I'm not asking for your forgiveness, the letter continued. I don't deserve it. I know that now, but I do want you to have something. The items in the leather pouch are things Alex stole, things I managed to get back without him noticing. I know it's not much, but it's all I can offer you now. I opened the pouch and emptied the contents onto the table. A few pieces of my father's old coin collection and a couple of watches tumbled out. Nothing particularly valuable, but things that had sentimental meaning. She must have thought returning them would make up for what she'd done. It didn't. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it into the trash, letting the pouch sit there on the table. It was too little, too late, and nothing she could say would ever change that. I wished I could throw away the memories as easily as I had thrown away her words. But no matter how much I tried to push it all out of my mind, there were reminders of the betrayal everywhere. Whenever I drove through town, I saw the places we had gone together, the park where we used to walk on weekends, the diner where we had our first date, the store where we'd spend hours picking out paint colors for the house. Everything felt tainted, like the entire town was a monument to what we had lost. Then, one evening, I ran into Alex's sister at the grocery store. I had never met her before, but I recognized her from a photo Jessica had shown me once. She walked up to me, her expression a mix of awkwardness and pity. "I'm sorry about everything," she said. "I know my brother. I know what he did was terrible. I just wanted you to know that he's not. I mean, he wasn't always like this. He's made mistakes, but," she trailed off, unsure of what to say. I just nodded, not really wanting to engage in any kind of conversation about Alex or his past. I didn't care about his mistakes, or whether he used to be a better person. All I cared about was the fact that he had come into my life and ruined it. "I just hope you can find some kind of peace," she added softly. "You deserve better than this." After she walked away, I stood there in the aisle for a long time, staring blankly at the shelves. I wasn't sure what peace was supposed to look like. How do you find peace when you've been shattered into 1,000 pieces? How do you put yourself back together when you're not even sure who you are anymore? I left the store with nothing in my cart and drove home, the sun setting behind me as the sky turned a deep shade of purple. It felt like I was driving through a memory, like the world around me wasn't entirely real. Back at the house, I picked up the leather pouch and carried it out to the garage. I found a dusty old box on a shelf and tossed the pouch inside, sealing the lid shut and shoving it into a dark corner. I didn't want to see those things ever again. They belonged to a life that no longer existed. After I shoved the box into the corner of the garage, I realized I had no idea what I was doing with my life anymore. Each day was just a repetition of the last, and the weight of what had happened seemed to grow heavier. It felt as though I was carrying the burden of 2 years of betrayal, 5 years of Alex's theft, and 14 years of a marriage that had turned out to be a lie. I tried to throw myself into work, hoping that staying busy would keep the thoughts at bay, but the silence in the house always dragged me back to the same dark place. The divorce was finalized a few weeks later, but that didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. When I signed those papers, I expected to feel some kind of relief, as if cutting that final tie would free me from the pain. Instead, it just felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I had known. I was officially no longer her husband, but the years of shared history, the memories we had created, didn't disappear. They lingered like shadows in the corners of the house, taunting me with what could have been. I tried to make some changes around the house, hoping that maybe a fresh coat of paint or some new furniture would help me move on. But no matter what I did, it still felt like Jessica was there, her presence haunting the spaces she had once filled. I considered selling the place, starting over somewhere new, but the thought of leaving the house I had poured so much of myself into only made the emptiness feel deeper. I had already lost enough. I didn't want to lose my home, too. Then one day, I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Mike, and he had heard through the grapevine what had happened. He wanted to catch up, maybe grab a drink sometime. At first, I was reluctant. I hadn't been in the mood for company, and the thought of sharing my story with yet another person felt exhausting. But I agreed, thinking that maybe, just maybe, talking to someone who wasn't part of the whole mess could offer a different perspective. We met at a bar on the edge of town. Mike looked the same as I remembered. Graying hair, a bit more weight around the middle, but still with that familiar, easygoing grin. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up on the years we'd lost touch, before the conversation inevitably turned to what had happened. "So, I heard about Jessica," he said cautiously. "I'm sorry, man. That's a hell of a thing to go through." I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. "It is what it is. Not much I can do about it now." Mike nodded, his expression sympathetic. "It's just, I don't know. Hard to believe she could do something like that." You two seemed solid. "Yeah, well," I replied bitterly, "we weren't." He was quiet for a moment, then he leaned in a little closer. "You know, I don't want to dig up the past or anything, but I did some work with Alex's brother a while back. You know about his family, right?" "I know he has a sister," I said, remembering my brief encounter with her in the grocery store. "And apparently a brother." Mike gave me a look that suggested there was more to the story. His brother's got a pretty shady past, too. Ran with a bad crowd when he was younger. I guess it runs in the family. I felt a pang of anger in my chest, not at Mike, but at the fact that I had let someone like Alex and his baggage into my life. "What's your point?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Look, I'm just saying be careful," he replied. "These things don't always stay in the past. I know you've been through enough, but sometimes, when people get desperate, they don't just disappear." I dismissed Mike's words as mere speculation, a warning from an old friend who probably meant well but didn't really know the situation. I thanked him for the advice and left the bar feeling restless. What had I really learned? Anyway, that Alex was a bad apple from a rotten tree? I already knew that. Nothing Mike had said changed anything. But then, a few nights later, I woke up in a cold sweat, a strange feeling of unease gripping me. It was just after 2 a.m., and the house was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I lay there, listening to the silence, and then I heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from downstairs. My heart leaped into my throat as I reached for the baseball bat I kept under the bed. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe just the house settling or the wind rattling a loose window. I crept down the stairs, gripping the bat tightly, every step sending a shiver up my spine. As I reached the bottom, I saw the source of the noise, a shadowy figure by the back door, trying to pry it open. I flipped on the lights, and the figure froze. It was Alex. He looked rough, gaunt, unshaven, and wild-eyed, like a man who had been dragged through hell. It made sense. He was out on parole after serving only part of his 5-year sentence. "Alex!" I shouted, my voice booming with a mix of fury and fear. "What the hell are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his hands still clutching a crowbar. I just came to get what's mine," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's nothing here for you," I spat back, raising the bat as I took a step closer. "Get out, or I swear I'll call the police." He held up his hands in mock surrender, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "Look, Tom, I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just need some cash, okay? I've got nothing." "Go back to where you belong," I snarled. "You've taken enough from me already." He hesitated for a moment, then his expression turned bitter. "Jessica told me to come here," he said suddenly, his words dripping with resentment. "She told me there was still something left." "Jessica?" I echoed, my grip on the bat tightening. "You're lying." "Am I?" Alex sneered. "She sent me a letter while I was inside. Said you still had some of the stuff I took. She figured you'd hold on to it, just out of spite." I felt a cold chill run through me as I realized he was talking about the items Jessica had returned, the few things she had given back to me in that leather pouch. But why would she tell him to come here? Was it just one last act of betrayal? Or had she truly believed he deserved to have them back? "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, my anger seeping through every word. "Before I do something we both regret." Alex stared at me for a moment longer, then turned and fled through the back door, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, the the bat still clutched in my hands, wondering if it was all just some sick joke, or if Jessica really had sent him back into my life one last time. The next morning, I went to the police and reported the attempted break-in. They assured me they'd keep an eye out for Alex, but I could tell they didn't see him as a serious threat. It wasn't until later that day, when I found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address, that I understood. Inside was another letter from Jessica, written from prison. "Tom, I'm sorry for everything," the letter said. "I know you hate me, but Alex doesn't have anywhere else to go. I know he's desperate, but he isn't dangerous. Please don't let him go back to prison. He's suffered enough, and so have you." It was the last thing I needed. Another plea from the woman who had already taken everything from me. I tore up the letter and threw it in the trash. I wasn't going to let her, or Alex, back into my life. They had both made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. As I looked around the house that night, the silence seemed different somehow, less suffocating, but no less lonely. It wasn't just the end of a marriage or a betrayal that I was dealing with. It was the end of a chapter of my life that I had thought would last forever. Now, all I could do was pick up the pieces and move on, one day at a time. Maybe that was what closure really was. Not a moment of triumph, but the slow acceptance of what was and what could never be again. I wasn't sure if I'd ever find peace, but at least I could find a way forward. And for now, that would have to be enough. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.